Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Moya-McLean and I'm joined by Mike Bankole. Mike.
How's it going? Hope you're well, Moya.
How is it going? I mean, I'm sure we'll find out during the course of the show. Coming up later tonight, Chancellor Rachel Reeves is facing a backlash after cutting payments to 10 million pensioners. Meanwhile, it's been revealed that the Labour Party lost thousands of Black and Asian votes at the last election, and Israeli protesters are furious that IDF soldiers might be held accountable for the violent sexual abuse of a Palestinian prisoner. Stay tuned for all of that. Make sure to also let us know your comments on YouTube Super Chat, or you can tweet at us on the hashtag Novara Live. But I just want to say something before we start. The weather is very hot. It is about 31 degrees right now, and I am wearing a strappy top. And I know the last time I wore a strappy top in the studio, it caused quite a lot of consternation among the YouTube comments. But I'm sure we are all adults and not misogynists, and we can handle that. So I just wanted to precede the show by letting you know. New Foreign Secretary David Lammy was in the House of Commons today, taking his very first session of Foreign Office questions from MPs, and a lot of them were about Palestine. Lammy opened the discussion by saying this.
We want a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel along a viable, sovereign Palestinian state. We're committed to recognising a Palestinian state as a contribution to a peace process at a time that's most conducive to that process.
What does that mean? Nothing, really, because it's quite obviously kicking the can of Palestinian statehood recognition down the road. This wasn't missed by Liverpool MP Paula Barker, who pressed Lammy on the exact timeline for Britain recognising a Palestinian state.
I must press him further on government recognition of a Palestinian state. This should have been a starting point 30 years ago. I believe recognition would level the playing field and would kickstart the peace process, which has been recognised by so many of our European counterparts. Recognition should not be at the conclusion. So what will the government do if Israel refuses to entertain any moves towards a two-state solution, which they have persistently and vocally rejected?
Now, Lammy refused to give a timeline, saying vaguely that a Palestinian state was, quote, a just cause, and that the UK government would, quote, work with other partners to bring that about. How, you might ask? Well, Lammy was further grilled on the issue by independent Blackburn MP Adnan Hussain.
I hear what the Minister said, but would he agree that the immediate recognition of the state of Palestine is A, vital to the UK's commitment in upholding of international laws and norms, B, vital to the processes required to bring about an immediate and just peace, and also vital to the notion that diplomatic means are not violence or the means to resolving this conflict. And in taking this matter further, would the Minister agree that failure to recognise the state of Palestine has already had and continues to have catastrophic implications on the people of Palestine as they face what the International Court has described as a plausible genocide?
So basically what Hussein is asking there is, do you not think that failing to recognise a Palestinian state has already left it to the mercy of Israel and impeded any sort of peace process? Lammy's reply? No.
The Honourable Gentleman is right that peace will be achieved through a political solution, not through military means. But I disagree with him that it is recognition itself that will bring about peace. It is the Biden plan that is on the table at the moment that we would like to see Hamas accept, and of course the leadership of Israel accept. That is what will give us a ceasefire and get us to a place where we can achieve that two-state solution.
Right. The Biden plan. That's what will bring about a ceasefire. Not pressing for the immediate cessation of all US funding to Israel or, stopping all arms to Israel, full stop, or strict sanctions on Israel. Not that. Instead, it's the plan that Israel has said it won't accept. That's going to stop the fighting. Sure. As for the UK ending arms sales to Israel, when Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell asked him not to do this, Lammy said this.
Can I say to him, he will know that these are very, very serious issues, that the test under criteria 2C is whether there is a clear risk. That is based on very careful assessments and careful assessments of the law. He would expect me to pursue that with all sobriety and integrity, and that is what I intend to do.
That's not a yes, and it's not a no. This was the theme of the session. Foreign Office Minister Annalise Dodds also refused to confirm if the government would commit to ending arms sales to Israel. And when asked if the government would still publish legal advice on those arms sales, Dodds said Lammy would be, quote, as transparent as he can. She also dodged a question on whether the government would back a mass polio vaccination scheme in Gaza. Then the question of what the government would be doing about illegal settlements in the West Bank came up.
Can the Minister be clear? The judgment or the opinion given by the ICJ is quite clearly that the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem is illegal. The settlement policy is illegal. Does the government accept that view? In accepting that view, what actions are they going to take to ensure that appropriate sanctions are made against Israel, including ending arms supplies to them, to ensure that that judgment is carried out and the people of Palestine will be able to live in peace and not under occupation?
This is an extremely complex finding of 90 pages issued after considerable deliberations by the ICJ, with a variety of views from the judges. As we said at the time, it will take us some time to respond to the full judgment, and we'll update this House when we're in a position to do so. Sanctions will remain under review, as I've discussed in the previous answer.
Mike, there was a lot of equivocation there. Is stalling the new Labour policy on Palestine?
I think partly. I think Labour are trying to do two things here. Labour are trying to maintain this relationship with Israel. And in many ways, Labour, as we know, have a strong connection with Israel. We know that there are many Labour MPs who are members of Labour Friends for Israel. And Labour are also trying to signal to some voters who essentially, at the general election, rejected the Labour Party because of its stance on Gaza, are trying to signal a softer approach to its kind of the Palestinian statehood, etc. What's happening is Labour's kind of falling between two stools, because you can't on one hand be like, yeah, we're kind of on good terms with Netanyahu, and also try and appease to voters who had a really strong apprehension voting Labour given its stance on kind of Gaza and Palestine. And I think ultimately what Labour needs to do essentially is go hard and go fast. So Labour, and we all know where Netanyahu is when it comes to two-state solution, for example. So the idea that we can kind of wait for it to be convenient for Israel, or have kind of conversations with Israel to kind of push for Palestinian statehood, is a complete fallacy. When we look at the language that's been used since October the 7th by Israeli leaders, even before that by Israeli leaders, this is dehumanizing rhetoric. This is rhetoric that is essentially presenting Palestinians as animals, right? And what we've seen even prior to October the 7th, right? What we saw is Human Rights Watch calling Israel's regime an apartheid regime, right? Where we see laws and policies implemented and passed to treat Palestinians as second-class citizens. So we are in no position, as things stand, to kind of sit around a table, have coffee with Israel and see how things go. We're in a position now where there needs to be talks of arms sales stopping. We need to talk about sanctions on Israel. So I think in some ways Labour are stalling, but Labour trying to kind of hold this position of being the peacemakers and trying to kind of come through in the middle, and we're going to talk to Israel, and this is implication, I think, in lots of what Labour's doing and saying is that Israel's kind of implicitly in Labour's views acting in good faith. We can have conversations, we can kind of come round to a two-state solution. But we have to understand years and years and decades of the dehumanization of Palestinians show us anything but a kind of a group of people we can kind of sit around the table with. There needs to be concerted pressure on Labour, by Labour on Israel. And I think the context for me is quite interesting, because I saw last week loads of people were getting really excited about Labour's stance in Israel. And I understand that, right? Because there was this idea of the ICC position and that being dropped, and everyone was like, wow, okay, maybe they're doing some good things. And then I think the report came out about whether, they might ban some arms sales. And all of that stuff was allowing people to begin to think, what, maybe Labour are waking up. I do think Lammy's answers and the kind of like on defence type of answers he gave indicate to me a position of trying to hold a position that for me is untenable. It's an untenable position when it comes to justice of Palestinians, and it's an untenable position just in general, in terms of if they want to win back the voters that voted against the party. I don't think that's really that important. I think what's more important for me is the liberation of Palestinians. But if you're thinking about politically for Labour, if they do want to win over those voters, the stance taken as kind of like on defence stance and slightly softer, it wouldn't be enough.
I wonder, do you think that Labour now Labour are in government, are Labour MPs more willing to speak out against Palestine? There were so many questions to David Lammy and to the other Foreign Office ministers that we just couldn't play because we didn't have time. Just scores of MPs asking about what the government's going to do about the humanitarian situation, what they're going to do about the arms sale. Just to show, that now Labour in government, they're willing to actually press their own cabinet on any action.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the Labour MPs, a lot of them, for example, when they were in the previous government with the Conservatives, they were MPs, I know Paula, for example, and quite a few on the left would have been quite vocal on Palestine, right? And I think now that Labour are in government, they will see it as their duty to be the kind of noisy backbenchers. And I think we have to remember with British politics, it is over the shoulder politics. So in many ways, the people you worry about the most are people in your backbenches. And I think those in the backbenches realise they have some power now. They are in government, Labour are in government. They have the ability and the opportunity to put pressure on a Labour government with a hope of kind of changing the dial and shifting the dial. I think also, again, strategically, and I do think this is an important point to make because we have to understand that politicians are rational and strategic actors. A lot of these Labour MPs will realise that Gaza was a massive issue of the last election. Now, whether it's a massive issue, the next election remains to be seen, but it's a massive issue, and constituents care about it. Prior to a lot of what we were told before the election, it wasn't really a big issue. Turned out it was a fairly big issue. So I think a lot of these MPs as well think strategically beyond their kind of personal, desire to see a free Palestine. There's strategically a desire to also advocate for this issue, given that it's going to reflect well for lots of constituents. So I think, these Labour MPs are using the opportunity to put pressure on Labour governments. And realistically speaking, there's far more chance of Labour adopting a far more progressive stance on Palestine than there was with the Conservatives. Let's speak of the Conservative stance. And Labour stance doesn't deserve like loads of praise, and we shouldn't be clapping and on the streets celebrating their stance. I mean, it's softer, sure, but the Conservative stance was one that was never going to lead to anything close to kind of any pressure on Israel. So, yes, Labour MPs should use a chance to put pressure on, and I think a lot of them are going to do that.
The Foreign Office question session where the Conservative MPs are saying, please promise us you will not cut ties with Israel, you will not do an arms embargo. And Lammy was like, well, I can't promise anything. A quick bit of good news about Novara Media. We have recently surpassed 800,000 YouTube subscribers. That's a lot of you watching right now. So thank you to each and every one of you for subscribing. If you like our coverage, do spread the word. If you don't already subscribe to us and you're watching us, come on, click the button. And also consider backing us financially. We are entirely supported by our audience. So if you want to do that, go to novaramedia.com/support. That link is novaramedia.com/support. It's in the description below. It lives in my dreams. I can recite it at any given point of time. So if you'd like me to continue being able to do that, sling us some cash. Rachel Reeves yesterday revealed a £22 billion hole in the nation's finances, at least according to the fiscal ideology she subscribes to. Now, she said this was caused by the overspending of the last Tory government. Where did it go? Where did that money go? In the speech, she announced a number of policy cancellations and money-saving measures. Apparently, this isn't a budget. It was just a statement. Tell me what the difference is, please. I'm sure there is one, but feels a bit like a mini budget. There was also much needed pay rises for public sector workers. But Reeves also declared a benefits cut, depriving 10 million pensioners of the winter fuel allowance. That combination of spending and cutting led to some predictable headlines. This was the Daily Mail's front page leader. So now we know who will pay for Labour's spending. Old folk on modest pensions, wrote Andrew Neil from his French villa. But Neil isn't really wrong. It's not a great look when, for example, the Chancellor could have chosen to take money off rich people instead. On BBC Breakfast, Reeves gave this justification for her decision.
The decisions I made on winter fuel payment yesterday are not decisions I wanted to make. They were not decisions that I expected to make. But when confronted with a £22 billion black hole, I had to act. And now I've preserved winter fuel payments for pensioners on pension credit. So a single pensioner with an income of just below £12,000 will continue to receive the winter fuel payment, and a pensioner couple on an income of just under £18,000 will continue to receive the winter fuel payment.
Now, £12,000 a year, or £18,000 for a couple, isn't a huge amount of money for an elderly person to live off. It's basically the state pension. But if a pensioner has an even lower income than that while having savings, they may also fail to qualify for pension credit. That means Reeves's cut is deep. And it's also a U-turn. Reeves was confronted on Good Morning Britain and presented with Labour's position on winter fuel payments just last year.
Your own Chief Secretary to the Treasury, when you were in opposition in November, wrote a letter to the Chancellor saying pensioners must not be forced to bear the brunt of Tory economic failure. And it was a direct question about whether pensioners who, he said, Darren Jones would be deeply concerned and anxious, would be stripped of the winter fuel payment. So your own Chief Secretary to the Treasury did not want to see this and was concerned that the Tory government would do it. Why is it OK for you to do it, but not for them?
We didn't want to do this, but we were forced yesterday to find urgent savings to put our public finances and public spending back on a firmer footing.
I love the divisions between media and politics. It's great to see the husband of the current Home Secretary sitting there while the Chancellor is grilled. But the thing is, that cut doesn't put the public finances on a much firmer footing. It's expected to raise just £1.5 billion a year at the expense of 10 million pensioners who will lose out on that payment. And not all facing this cut are wealthier or more affluent, as articles in The Guardian described them. Rather, the loss of the new means-tested payment is going to hit many pensioners hard, especially those on lower incomes but who are not receiving benefits. One of those pensioners being stung by the change is this caller to LBC.
I'm incandescent about it. I couldn't have believed that a Labour government would have ever done anything so iniquitous. Me and my partner are both disabled pensioners, so we fall into the category that your guest has just talked about.
Yes.
We've applied for pension credit and we are just over the threshold. We've got a few pounds a week too much between us to be able to claim it, and yet we're both housebound because we're both disabled. My partner's completely bedbound. We have carers. We are going to be hundreds of pounds a year worse off. There will be more pensioners that die of hypothermia this winter or malnutrition, because there will be people who are having to make choices between heating and eating. I just feel this is not a Labour government. This is not even a new Labour government. It's a new Tory government, because they had choices. They could have done something to raise more money, for example. They could have put the bank levy back on the banks, which the Tories took off. They had all sorts of choices. Why clobber pensioners? I think they will pay for this at the next election, because we will never, ever vote Labour again. And we voted Labour all our lives. We will never vote Labour again.
Really, that's significant for you and your partner.
I just think it's so iniquitous, so unfair. I really can't believe that a Labour government have done this. They turned themselves into the new nasty party, or the even nastier party, because even the Tories didn't do this.
Charities for older people agree with that caller. The charity director of Age UK said this about the change. We strongly oppose the means testing of the winter fuel payment because our initial estimate is that as many as 2 million pensioners who badly need the money to stay warm this winter will not receive it and will be in trouble as a result. Yet, at the other end of the spectrum, well-off older people will scarcely notice the difference, a social injustice. Just one thing on those well-off older people. Last year, the Office for National Statistics estimated there are over 1.1 million pensioners with pension pots worth £1 million or more. A different form of raising money, like equalising capital gains with income tax, would have affected them rather than some of the country's poorest people. It would also raise far more than that £1.5 billion. According to one study, equalising capital gains would raise £16.5 billion every year. And the Telegraph reports that Treasury officials are already proposing raising capital gains tax in the autumn budget. But that will be too late for the 2 million poorest pensioners raided by Reeves's Treasury first. they will feel the sting this winter. I guess austerity has to start somewhere. The General Secretary of the National Pensioners Convention said this about the cut. This is devastating news for millions of older people whose income is literally just a few pounds above the threshold to receive pension credit. I seriously believe the Chancellor has underestimated the harm her decision will cause to older people still struggling with energy costs and facing higher rates in October. It's absolutely shocking that the new Labour government should treat older vulnerable people in this manner. It is crazy that Rachel Reeves, less than 3 weeks into a new Labour government, said, you know what I'm going to start with? I'm going to cut the pensioners. Mike, why does Rachel Reeves want to start with the bad news? Does this mean there is no good news down the line?
I fear there won't be any good news down the line. I honestly do think a lot of this, and one of the ways in which Labour have been consistent for the past kind of 4 or 5 years under Starmer has been an economic position in many ways, because there has been this tone, and they've slowly but surely shifted to the right on lots of economic policies. But there's always been this tone of we need to be seen as economically prudent and competent. That's been the entire kind of stance Labour have adopted. So when Rachel Reeves gives her speech yesterday, the entire tone of the speech is, hey, look, listen, we're just doing what's best for business. We're just doing what's best for the country. We're just trying to be economically competent. That's the tone. And I think that tone is the tone that was used by, if we remember, George Osborne and David Cameron in 2010. It was the idea of, well, look, tough decisions need to be made. And I agree with Rachel Reeves. I think she is correct. The tough decisions need to be made, but not the ones that she's made. The ones that she's made are decisions that are going to, really affect, as has been spoken about so far, really old and vulnerable people in this country. Those aren't decisions we should be making. The decisions we should be making is trying to, ask those who have the most to kind of shoulder the burden, when it comes to raising taxes, for example, and trying to get to a position where we know that Britain is broken. Britain is broken in so many ways, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of when it comes to the care sector, when it comes to housing, etc. And all of this is going to require time and patience to fix. But there are decisions that we can make economically to raise the money required to kind of boost and allow us to spend more in these sectors. And increasing taxes on those who have the broader shoulders is one of those. That wasn't included at all in Rachel Reeves' speech yesterday. So I think what the government are doing is actually making these deliberate choices that are going to set the stage for further cuts down the line and a far more restrictive policy approach. Now, Labour are going to damage themselves by doing this, right? Because we know that this was an election Labour won on the promise of change, right? So the whole thing is, vote for us, we're going to change this country and make it better. The problem is, if people think their lives are getting worse, old voters, for example, they're suffering as a result of this decision. When it comes to two-child benefit cap, if that's not reversed, and big families, on low incomes are suffering as a result. If all these things, if Britain continues to be broken when it comes to the care sector or education or employment, wherever it might be, then the buck will stop at Labour, and people thinking, well, Labour promised change and haven't delivered change. So for Labour, they need to make people's lives better. We need a fairer economy. We need an economy where there's more equality, where people who are marginalised are looked after and are supported. And these decisions and the kind of tone used by Rachel Reeves yesterday suggests to me that the opposite might happen. And things actually, in some ways, might get worse for some of the most marginalised and vulnerable people in Britain.
Israeli protesters have stormed not one, but 2 IDF bases after 9 reservist soldiers were detained by military police. According to their defense lawyer, the soldiers were held on suspicion of sexual abuse of a Palestinian imprisoned at the Seder Teman detention center in southern Israel. But their arrest triggered an angry response from supporters, including members of Israel's parliament, the Knesset. As news of the soldiers' arrest broke, hundreds of protesters gathered outside the base, waving Israeli flags and calling for the release of the soldiers. At the same time, other soldiers on the base refused to cooperate with the military police, barricading themselves inside the compound. According to Haaretz, some even used pepper spray on the police trying to enter. A second wave of protesters stormed through the centre's outer gates, remaining there for several hours before police escorted them out. Just to be clear, the protesters were not demonstrating against the alleged sexual abuse of a Palestinian prisoner. The victim of that abuse was described by Haaretz as having severe injuries to an intimate body part, injuries that left him unable to walk. No, those Israelis were protesting the idea that IDF soldiers should be held to account for committing what amounts to rape on a prisoner. One protester told Reuters why he was there.
The soldiers in this country are a consensus. If they touch our soldiers, we'll build a shield wall. The people will rise up against the government, be it left or right or whatever. Nobody can touch our soldiers. Not the people who died defending us, not my friends who died defending us, not my friends who still stay in the Soroka hospital. We're here for our soldiers, not for our politicians, not for the terrorists. No, we're here to let everybody know. Nobody will touch our soldiers, our brothers in arms.
Later, around 1,200 further protesters gathered outside the Beit Lid IDF base where the 9 soldiers had been taken for questioning. Dozens of them were able to break into the base. Some were masked and armed, and the Times of Israel reports that others carried guns and wore IDF uniforms. According to Israeli police, the mob was soon dispersed. Amazingly, no arrests were made at either site. In response to the protests and break-ins, some Israeli politicians offered mild criticism. Defense Minister and potential subject of an ICC arrest warrant, Yoav Gallant, said this. IDF regular and reserve fighters have been fighting fiercely for over 9 months in the most just war we have known in all our years of existence. I'm full of appreciation for the soldiers who carry out the complex and important task of imprisoning Hamas terrorists, vile terrorists with whom we will come to account and exhaust the law in the strictest way. The IDF will continue to act in accordance with the law. We must allow the authorised parties to carry out the necessary tests while maintaining the dignity of our soldiers. Even when angry, the laws bind everyone. Do not break into IDF bases and do not violate the laws of the State of Israel. Other members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet expressed their support for the detained soldiers. This was the view of Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. The civil protest around the terrible injustice towards the reservists in the Yemen field is justified, and I support it with all my heart. In contrast to the hypocritical left, who made breaking the law, refusing and burning the state a method for a year and a half, and the auspices of the Yamesh, we have a responsibility to the state. Therefore, I call on everyone to maintain the law and the integrity of the army and the people, not to break into the bases and not to confront our brothers, the soldiers and the police, and to main the borders of the protest. Meanwhile, Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, said this. The spectacle of military police officers coming to arrest our best heroes as Sede Timen is nothing less than shameful. I recommend that the Defense Minister, the IDF Chief of Staff, and the army authorities back the fighters and learn from the prison service. The summer camps are over, and patience for the terrorists are over. Fighters should get full backing. It's like a far-right galaxy brain meme, that series of those responses. Now, the Sede Timen detention centre, where the Palestinian prisoner was allegedly sexually assaulted by 9 soldiers, has a long history of abuse of prisoners. Last month, the New York Times investigation revealed the base was filled with thousands of blindfolded and handcuffed Palestinian captives, many held without charge or legal representation. In April, Haaretz reported on a doctor at Sede Timen who had seen alleged widespread law-breaking in the treatment of Palestinian prisoners. The illegal acts he listed included routine amputation of detainees' legs due to handcuff injuries, keeping prisoners constantly in retreats, and forcing them to defecate in diapers. We reported on those allegations at the time. Haaretz has also called for the closing of what it calls Israel's Guantanamo Bay later that month, following allegations of torture, as well as the death of 27 detainees over a period of mere months. I'm now joined by Dimi Reader, who is the national editor of The Lead and co-founder of the 972 magazine. Dimi, on those protesters that stormed the military base, can you give us some more detail on what you've heard about them, what they were chanting or demanding?
They were generally demanding that police and the authorities concentrate on fighting and prosecuting terrorists rather than their own soldiers, chanting in support of the war, in support of letting the army do its job, and so on and so forth. The rather new development was, that they actually forcefully infiltrated a military base, which is quite unusual, and it's quite telling that they were allowed to get as far as they did. If Israeli leftists tried to do that, the response from police and the army would have been quite different, and obviously even more so if they were Palestinians. The other new thing was the amount of right-wing politicians including some nationally known ones, directly confronting the army and, again, trespassing. And thirdly, the presence of armed men among the protesters, who appear to be reservists from the same unit that staffs the prison. We can't tell for sure because they were wearing balaclavas, but you could very much see that those men were wearing military fatigues, t-shirts, balaclavas, and carrying their army-issue weapons. They didn't point the weapons at anyone at any time, but they were certainly present in a very vivid way.
What does this say about the current climate in Israel, that there has been rioting to defend soldiers accused of sexual crimes against prisoners, and that rioting seems to involve, reservists, far-right politicians who are opposing the military police? Where does the power lie now?
I think the power is fracturing, and it's too soon to tell where it will eventually settle. The majority of power is still with the state. We shouldn't. This is probably the beginning of a process. We're not quite there. We're not in civil war of any sort. We're not in a collapse of the state. But it's certainly showing that society is fracturing, that the army discipline is fraying, which we've also seen in Gaza in terms of how soldiers behave there. And it's showing, I think, that it will be quite difficult domestically for Netanyahu to end the war on any terms that don't suit his far-right coalition partners.
Can you tell us a bit more about the response or apparent involvement of Israeli politicians within the rioting?
So on the ground, you had Tzvi Sukkot, who's a well-known settler activist before he was a member of the Knesset. You have Nissim Vaturi and a few other people belonging to the Likud and to other right-wing parties. The much more interesting involvement, or alleged involvement, is that of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who himself has a past of being convicted of support of terrorism and is now the police minister in Israel. The accusation, he's been accused by Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of ordering the police to stand down and not interfere. I would say he didn't necessarily have to do that for several reasons. One, it might have been a conscious decision by police to not to intervene forcefully unless they absolutely had to de-escalate. And if that was the strategy, it appears to have paid off in terms of no one was seriously physically hurt. And the riot hasn't escalated, and today has kind of like fallen back to the usual level of demonstrations outside the perimeter of military bases and prisons. The other thing is that Ben-Gvir has been in control of the police for almost 2 years now, and he has been quite successful at, if not exactly taking over the police, but certainly promoting people who agree with him. And kind of like organizations don't necessarily need a written detailed order from whoever heads it up to anticipate what they would prefer and what would pay off for their own careers in the long term. And thirdly, of course, the Israeli police has been continually radicalized over the last few years by a variety of factors. They've long been underpaid, undertrained. They've been working ridiculous hours because of the continuous civil unrest and protests against Netanyahu's government in any way. They took a lot of the first impact of the Hamas attack on October 7th. An unprecedented number of police were killed. So they're generally, on the one hand, they're being alienated from a lot of the civil society in Israel on the one hand, and on the other hand, the power within the organization clearly lies to the right. So there are plenty of factors there that would make a direct order from Ben-Gvir to stand down redundant.
These alleged sexual crimes are by no means the first reported abuse at Seder Timon. The military police were, of course, right to move on these, but why these? And why not any other abuse that has been reported at that prison?
I really can't say why they chose this one in particular. It might be simply that this was reported from within the system. Unlike other reports, which were journalistic reports and investigations by people like Hagar Shazaf at Haaretz and Yuval Avram at 972 Local Call, this was actually brought to the attention of the authorities by doctors in a hospital where the detainee was brought, and they examined him and said there is absolutely no way that this could have happened, these injuries could have happened naturally, or they were self-inflicted. So perhaps that made it more difficult to ignore it, or maybe the kind of like the evidential basis was stronger because military police, perhaps even more than normal police, don't move unless they have, they're pretty sure that they can prosecute and convict. And this bar is higher within the Israeli military, but that very, very rarely prosecutes soldiers for violence against Palestinians. The particular manner in which they decided to move in has since been criticized. The detained soldiers are reservists, and arguments have been advanced that they could have been much more quietly picked up in their own homes, separately and over a period of time, rather than military police showing up in force, also wearing balaclavas and very much kind of like staging it as a raid against armed dangerous suspect. And being met with this resistance from the other prison personnel. The military police is saying that they were trying to make sure that they get all the suspects at once and to prevent any of them from escaping or to prevent them from coordinating their stories. But it's undoubtedly going to be much of the focus of the conversation in Israel, and we'll hopefully learn more in the weeks to come.
Have there been any consequences for protesters as of yet?
None whatsoever. There have been no arrests, and there was one protester was detained. I'm not sure if he's still in detention after he broke into the second military base. But beyond that, there have been no consequences yet. Again, this could be simply police deciding we have the footage, we know who these people are, and we're going to pick them up later, rather than kind of like arrest them very publicly in the middle of a riot and risk prolonging it. I'm giving police the benefit of the doubt here. They are, again, notoriously kid-gloved with the Israeli far right, so it's more likely that there will be no consequence at all.
Security has been constantly cited as the rationale for the oppression of people in the occupied Palestinian territories by Israel. It is now cited as the reason for prolonging this genocide. But now the unrest is coming from within the house. The call is coming from inside the house. So what does this mean for Israeli society that we're now seeing schisms of this type break into outright violence?
I think we're going deeper and deeper into uncharted territory for Israel. Like, to begin with, first of all, October 7th itself, unprecedented in terms of like how deep enemy forces went into Israel's sovereign territory, how quickly they managed to get to civilian communities, take over, etc., etc. We are now also in Israel's longest ever war, and Israel is simply not made militarily or economically to fight long wars. We are too small and too sensitive, high-geared an economy for that, which is one of the many reasons why cooler heads so far have prevailed with regards to regional war or war against Hezbollah and Iran and so on. Then you have the fact that we just have many more guns around. So on the one hand, we had some of the toughest gun laws in the world until October. And in October, Ben Gvir started handing out guns like candies. We've had an 800% rise in gun permits by February. I don't think there have been more recent stats released, but I imagine it's much higher than that. And we already had, for instance, I think earlier this year, we had a football game canceled because a lot of the fans showed up armed just because they recently acquired gun permits. So there's a lot more handguns going around. And then you have also an unprecedented number of reserve soldiers being mobilized for unprecedented lengths of time, which means that they are, even when they're on break or on leave, many of them keep their guns because they're going to, the leave is short and temporary. They're going to be called in again anyway. In terms of the security argument, it's always been politically tinted. Like we've had riots, say, by groups of settlers before where they attacked military vehicles. There was one, practically, I would say, an assassination attempt where where the brakes of the Jeep belonging to a very senior commander in the ADF were tampered with some years ago by someone who had access to the base. And that's attempts by the center-left to cast the settlement movement as a direct threat to Israeli security in the same way Palestinians are a threat to Israeli security have never really landed, because it's always understood that security is not just physical security, it's existential political security, and these people are ultimately, they're on our side in the sectarian sense. They're part of the same community. We'll see, I think, considering the amount of guns, considering the amount of anger, considering the dysfunction, the mismanagement of the war, we'll probably see repetitions of these scenes we've seen yesterday. And it's really only by miracle that nobody fired and nobody hit someone. And if that was to happen from whichever side, would be even deeper into uncharted waters. And there is no telling how the dynamics would escalate.
Dimi Reader, thank you so much for giving up your time there. I can't help thinking that this sort of internal unrest, Israel eating itself perhaps, is what happens when a society legitimizes violence, destruction as a response to the emotions of fear, collective emotions of fear and guilt, and prizes this, absolutely warped idea of security at all costs. What happens when the mirror is turned on itself? This. We have a breaking news update. Speaking of what happens when a society is legitimizing the idea of fear and violence as proportionate responses to any sort of traumatization. Since we've gone live, it's been reported that the Israeli military have bombed Beirut in Lebanon. That is Lebanon's capital, Beirut. Al Jazeera said there was a loud blast and a plume of smoke could be seen rising in a southern suburb of the Lebanese capital. Sky News says there's quite a lot of damage done to the buildings, apparently a Hezbollah stronghold. Their words, not mine. The IDF has said it was a targeted strike on a Hezbollah commander responsible for the murder of children in Golan Heights and, this is their words, the killing of numerous additional Israeli civilians. We will keep you updated if there's any more breaking news on that. The Labour Party won the general election in July by a landslide, but their victory wasn't due to a massive surge of support for Labour. Labour's vote share was only 1.7 points higher than in 2019, which is when the Conservatives won an 80-seat majority. Instead, Labour triumphed thanks to the complete collapse of the Conservative Party vote. Now the election dust has settled, and journalists are running the numbers to work out exactly who is part of the voting coalition that installed the first Labour government in 14 years. And reporting by The Independent has found this. Labour lost almost a third of Black and Asian support at the last election, according to polling by Ipsos for The Independent. And where did that support go? To independents, Greens and Reform. Here's a chart from the report authored by journalist Nadine White and Alicia Hagiopen. The burgundy bars represent the ethnic minority vote of all the parties. Labour lost the biggest amount of ethnic minority voters as it had the largest pool to lose in the first place. Of the parties that gained ethnic minority voters, Reform's vote share went up by 2%. The Greens increased their ethnic minority base by 9%, but it was independent candidates who benefited most from Labour's loss, gaining 13% of ethnic minority voters. I think that also shows in the fact that we had more independent candidates returned at this election than any other general election ever. And of those ethnic minority voters, the analysis showed that Black voters and those of mixed heritage are much more likely still to vote Labour than Asian voters. Labour had already lost ground with Asian voters in 2019, with an increasing number switching to the Conservatives. But this year, with the Conservative vote in freefall, other factors were at play. Voters of an Asian background were the group most likely to have their voting intention impacted by the genocide in Gaza, according to pre-election polling by More in Common. 1 in 5 Asian voters said it would influence how they cast their vote. While the situation in Gaza wasn't predictable, many did foresee Labour losing ethnic minority voters with their politics post-Jeremy Corbyn. This was journalist Jason Okundaye writing in 2019 for Tribune. The legacy of New Labour is uniting foreign and domestic policy through Islamophobia as an article of faith. The ethnic minority vote has somehow endured in spite of this. Much of it has, in fact, been recovered by Corbyn due to his history of anti-apartheid and anti-war activism. An abandonment of these principles and a lurch to the right will see those old wounds from New Labour reopened, and those deep fissures will paralyse ethnic minorities into political atheism by our hundreds of and thousands. And this was Kimberly McIntosh in The Guardian in the same year. Labour must remember the traditional working class includes minorities too. Talk of the party's heartlands only seems to include white votes, but throwing minorities under the bus will spell the end of Labour. Mike, Labour did lose ethnic minority voters, but they still won. It didn't spell the end of them. Will this just reinforce complacency about who they target their policies at?
I think it will. And I think what we've seen since 2016, and I think it's been a concerted trend from the political class, is to ignore Black and Asian voters, right? So in the 2016, the Brexit referendum, which was arguably the biggest referendum of our time, it's certainly in my lifetime, what happened was the working class were racialized as whites, right? So that ignored the experiences and voices of minority voters during that really massive and important referendum. We fast forward to 2021 and we see the widest and largest anti-racist protests in British history. We see these Black Lives Matter protests across the country. And the concerted responses was to launch the Cell report, which obviously found that institutional racism is no longer a thing, apparently. Now, we all know there's a load of baloney. And Labour's response to this was, yeah, we condemned the report, but nothing else has happened since then. So Labour has spoken about a Race Equality Act. Sure, that sounds lovely, I guess. But beyond that, Labour's approach to Black voters and to Asian voters hasn't been to reach out to them. It's been in many ways to dismiss them. So let's think about an issue that especially Muslim voters cared a lot about, and one we spoke about earlier on this show, Gaza. Now, Labour's response to that was to dismiss these voters, was to present them in some ways as extremists. You know, there was so much talk about these people who were very passionate about the cause of Palestine as being intimidating and aggressive. And in many ways, these people were just very, very passionate and naturally care a lot about genocide. You know, so and wanted to end genocide. So I don't see Labour pivoting all of a sudden to be like, well, oh look, you know, we've lost some of these voters. We're going to try and reach out to them, because I think Labour made a deliberate choice after 2019. Right, Labour diagnosed the defeat in 2019 as we lost the working class, and we need to, you know, win over the working class. And this involves a kind of pivot in some ways to the right. We need to be a bit harder on immigration. We need to be a bit harder on you know, other social issues as well. And the problem with that is, again, when it comes to they lost the working class, they didn't lose the working class because, again, most minorities in Britain are working class, and the working class minorities continue to vote in quite large numbers in 2019 for Labour. So I think over time what's happened is this complete erasure and invisibilisation of Black and minority ethnic voters. And Labour have just won an election despite having not pandered to Black and ethnic minority voters. So I don't see them all of a sudden being like, we probably need to do so. There might be some stuff on Gaza you spoke about earlier, slightly softer approach on Gaza. Yeah, sure, that might happen. But beyond that, I don't see Labour, you know, having this concerted effort to reach out to Black and minority ethnic voters. And I think this is one of the problems of our politics. One of the problems of our politics is there are groups of people who aren't voting in elections in large numbers. And we know that Black and Asian voters are less likely to vote in elections than other groups. And there's so little care for it. There's so little care for the fact that these people who are actually engaged in politics, they're just not engaged in the kind of the act of voting, for example, because they feel like there's no point in this, like in voting. There's very little care and consideration for that being a problem. That, for me, is a huge problem, that there are significant groups of people in this country from minority ethnic backgrounds who feel that they shouldn't be voting because, frankly, politics doesn't serve them. That is a huge problem, and I don't think Labour are going to do anything to address this. If anything, Labour are going to lurch to the right on issues that, you know, minority ethnic voters care about, and in some ways, their lurch to the right will be quite damaging for Black and minority ethnic voters. So let's think about their stance on immigration. And we know that Yvette Cooper's launched some quite essentially quite right-wing approaches to immigration in terms of, you know, we need strong borders and the kind of rhetoric of, you know, way in which they want to deal with the boats crossing. This isn't about providing safe routes. It's about the kind of the gangs and stuff. And what happens when governments adopt this really far right rhetoric on immigration is it tends to also impact, you know, people of colour in Britain, people of colour who literally were born in Britain and were bred in Britain. So we know the hostile environment that was kind of pursued by the Conservative government had ramifications on how Black people and Asian people were treated by public services. And if Labour continues to adopt a rhetoric and an approach on immigration that's quite far right and it's quite strong, what's going to happen is it's going to have a negative effect on people of colour in this country. And we know that the Nigel Farages of this world and the Tom Robinsons of this world are mobilising around these issues. And if Labour kind of pander to this, it's going to be bad. So I think in many ways, Labour aren't going to try and reach out to Black voters. They will pass some policies like a Race Relations Act, maybe some stuff on equal pay. That stuff will happen, and that stuff will no doubt in some ways be slightly positive. But a general political project Labour are going to pursue over the next few years is going to be one that continues and perpetuates the invisibilisation of of people of colour, and also quite crucially, it's going to lead to the victimization of people of colour as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting also the way the ignorance around the voting behaviours of ethnic minority voters and how different groups behave means that Labour they were just ignoring these massive swathes of people with different voting behaviours and just assuming it's a complete complacency. For example, British Indians, of all ethnic minority voters, were much more likely to back Leave than any other ethnic minority group. But Afro-Caribbeans, African voters, voters of Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage were more likely to back Remain, but British Indians were more likely to back Leave. And only a few people actually did research into why that was and how that then also influenced the realignment to, the rise of more British South Asians of an Indian background backing the Conservatives in 2019. But, these are all stats for another programme. We don't have time to cover all that today, maybe another day. Oh my gosh, wow. It's been a real words in my throat tonight. But anyway, thank you so much, Mike, for sticking with me despite my tongue getting tied. You've been an asset as always.
Always a pleasure being on with you, Moya.
And thank you everyone for watching this evening. We will be back tomorrow from 6 to try and stop us. For now, you have been watching Novara Media. Good night.